Over a year ago to Ukraine was, do you want to follow an economic support system and subsidy with Europe or Russia? The European system says, what we have in store for you, we're going to lower your living standards by 50%. We're going to take away the largest subsidy you have, the subsidy on gas, so it's going to cost much more to heat your houses and to operate. We're going to cut back public spending, and we have to make you look like Greece. Our system is one of austerity. Putin, on the other hand, said, well, we realize that there is a fraternal connection with you, just as we had with the Serbians and the Slavs. We're going to give you subsidized gas. We'll keep down your living costs. And after all, Russia is your major export market. And the United States then intervened. And why did it do this?
The United States has almost been paranoid about the prospects for Russia to devolve back into what it sees as a kind of Leninist or a Stalinist framework. And this has really plagued and poisoned U.S. relations with the country.
Is there any basis for that assumption?
No, there's really not. I mean, really what we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union was the people who would inherit the collapsed Soviet Union actually thought they were going to join the United States as partners. But this kind of toxic view of what the Soviet Union was and what Russia would be shaped what eventually did happen and the kind of relations that we would see between these two countries. And over time, this great mistrust of the United States by Russia's leadership.
Is there any wisdom in the U.S. policies, any of the legislation that's been passed in the latter part of last year?
No, I can't say that there is. The legislation that has come out of Congress has been particularly bad.
Well, of course, there wasn't wisdom, but what there was a strategy. And the strategy in Ukraine is the identical strategy thought up by Mr. Brzezinski 25 years ago in Afghanistan. Brzezinski was the strategist for Jimmy Carter and convinced Jimmy Carter to say, look, the Russians are dominating Afghanistan with a civilian secular government. Let's create a new organization. Let's create Al-Qaeda. Let's back Osama bin Laden and give his supporters weapons to begin fighting the Russians. And we can pull a coup d'etat there. And the Russians will fight back, and then we'll say the Russians invaded. And it worked. Saudi Arabia made a deal with America that they would push the Wahhabi extremists, the Al-Qaeda, the most right-wing wing of the Islamic parties, and it worked. Essentially, Al-Qaeda is a contract army for the United States. Well, the same thing was happening in Russia. What Brzezinski wrote was that America's faced with a possibility of not being able to rule the world unilaterally. And that would be a disaster for democracy. That we can't let any country's economic ability to be self-sufficient means potential military power. And in order to prevent any country from threatening America militarily, you have to prevent it from developing economically. The American nightmare, Brzezinski wrote, was that Russia would get together with Germany and with Western Europe, creating Russian raw materials, German industry, and somehow, finally, Russia would become westernized. America, under Brzezinski's strategy, said this would be a disaster because if Russia's westernized, if it becomes democratic, if Europe and Russia are prosperous, then we cannot control them anymore, and they will have no reason to be NATO. We've got to stop Russia, and the place to stop this Russian-European conglomeration is to split it right at the border down Ukraine. Let's do in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan. Let's back the crazies. Well, most of them are the former neo-Nazi groups that have been so prominent that fly the Nazi flags.
I don't want to present this idea of there being this kind of simplistic dichotomy in Ukraine between a kind of fascist force which has come into power against Russian military forces, thugs. I mean, all sorts of terms such as this have been used, pejorative terminology. It's more complicated. The Maidan was a very pluralistic movement. It contained left elements, centrist elements, hard right-wing elements. It's quite true, as both James and Michael have said, that the United States decided that it was going to pick winners. Now, this is something that the United States instructs or tells its client states in East Europe that they must never do with their economies. They're not allowed to help develop industries and pick winners. That would be bad. That would not allow the market to take place. But when it comes to politics, they're never going to allow the political market to operate. In other words, real democracy, and for the people to really determine what it is that they want. And so we see this picking of winners, in fact, by the United States. So what we've seen, unfortunately, is a situation in which the wishes of the people of Ukraine, for the most part, have been largely ignored.
This is exactly what happened in Russia after 1991. Russia essentially dismantled its manufacturing and its industry under World Bank and IMF tutelage. There were a number of American economists, Nobel Prize winners, who urged Russia to base its economy on natural resource rent and land rent, and not on taxing industry. And essentially, they proposed that Russia become a social democratic country like America is. In America, the government subsidizes technology, industry, and helps develop, but that wasn't the way that Russia went. In Russia, the Baltics, the post-Soviet states, they're not mixed economies. They're all privatized, and because they're privatized, they essentially are torn apart and have emigration. I think Latvia and the Baltics were probably a kind of laboratory. How can you convince a population voluntarily to lower its living standards, to have its young adult males that are educated and trained move to foreign countries and still vote for the neoliberals? And the answer is, as long as you can make the elections about hating the other side, about hating the Russians, about resenting the past injustices of Stalinism, then they're more concerned with their hatreds and the past than they are with developing themselves.
Now, in defense of those who are tendering these suggestions for aid and loan programs to Ukraine, I mean, what they're saying is, and I'm sure many believe this, that this money is going to come with strings attached. There are going to be reforms. We're going to eliminate corruption. All the stuff that we heard in Russia in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, none of it really transpired, which doesn't mean that it can't in Ukraine. But it was clear that that really was not the United States' chief priority, to clean up the government. I mean, they were quite happy with the Yeltsin government as long as it was allowing this process of privatizations to occur and the kind of wholesale looting of the country. And then, of course, eventually it had to end as it did, which it only could end when that is in the ruble crisis of 1998, when the whole thing just imploded. It could not be sustained. They could not attract foreign private money as well as they had been, with this illusion that somehow they were going to be able to pay this money back with interest. It all had to just come to a disastrous end. And unfortunately, I think that's probably what's going to happen to Ukraine. It'll be looted, and then it'll be a massive default in all of these debts. But from the perspective, for lack of a better term, of capital in the West, they won't care. They'll have gotten what they wanted, what they came for.
One of the things that has puzzled me throughout this crisis is, with all the trouble that the European Union is having digesting its newest members, why they would think to bring on a basket case like Ukraine. And so economically, it doesn't really make sense for a European Union that has just itself getting out of its own crisis of the past few years. And so I wonder if the motives could be elsewhere, and I suspect that they are. Look at the European Union Association Agreement. First of all, it proposes what they call a deep and comprehensive free trade area, but it also has specific security and foreign policy protocols embedded within it. And I think that that's sort of the key, because if Ukraine was to follow, and they've since signed it this past June, that would put them on the road to NATO membership. And I think that the crisis really is being driven in part by the desire to put Ukraine into NATO. And that's sort of extraordinary given the really sort of defensive nature of the original iteration of NATO. I mean, after all, at the very beginning, Lord Ismay said the point of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. And so that was a sort of defensive rationale. We're a long way from that now. But what strikes me when you hear American policymakers talk about this is that some of them genuinely still believe that NATO is a defensive alliance. But you couldn't possibly believe that given NATO's interventions in, say, Libya, for example, in 2011. And so I'm not sure if it's just naivete or cynicism, but there's something very wrong with the idea that the European Union and NATO have to expand to include almost, the entirety of the former Soviet space.
There was an agreement in the 80s. The Warsaw Pact states would be independent from the former Soviet Union, and NATO would not expand any further eastward.
This wasn't written down. It wasn't a formal codified legal accord. There was no need to actually create a treaty stating that this would not be done. It was just obvious that, they would never be foolish enough to actually encroach upon the Warsaw Pact. And then, as we saw in 2004, not only taking in all of the Warsaw Pact nations for the most part, but then taking former Soviet territory as well. And then, of course, the movements that we saw in Georgia in 2008 made it appear as if Georgia was next in line. So this is what gave the Russian leadership, and Vladimir Putin specifically, tremendous pause regarding the United States' intentions. Now, again, we have to remember that this is how World War I started, where you had lots of nations that were all linked together in these kind of military alliances in which a war can break out in a relatively localized place, and then it can quickly erupt into something far more significant. We just have to be, I think, a little bit smarter and understand that from the Soviet perspective, from a country that was completely destroyed during a Great World War, losing over 20 million people, that seeing the advance of a military alliance onto its borders, no matter how benign it appears today, when you take a long view of history, of course, you understand that nothing is permanent. Everything and anything can change. What is today a benign alliance, if that is how one sees it, can become a hostile one under a different order and a different system. So we really, really pushed their limits of tolerance.
Yeah, there's a central irony in all of this. NATO was formed ostensibly to make Western Europe secure against any Soviet threat. And today, the aim of NATO is to make Europe insecure against a Soviet threat. Western Ukraine, by bombing the Donbass, by threatening to drive Russians out of Crimea, it was as if the Americans were trying to prod Putin into doing something intemperate. Look, Europe, the Russian bear is raising its head, it's going to invade again. By restarting the Cold War and by making these threats, NATO is making Europe much more insecure, not only militarily, but also economically.
Now, Alex, if I can just interject, I mean, whether it's malevolence, as Michael is suggesting in terms of this policy, or as I'm suggesting, just stupidity. The net effect is that NATO is a force for instability, and it's increasing the prospect for military conflict. And this is very, very dangerous. And Putin, for all of the misgivings that I have about him personally, is somewhat of a moderate when it comes to these foreign policy issues. I mean, I've met with some of the hardliners in Russia, people like Alexander Dugin and the rest. And if they had their druthers, they would have just gone in and taken over Ukraine, no questions asked. And so Putin actually is a restraining force on those elements within Russia.
We're told incessantly that this Ukrainian crisis and now the civil war that's destroying the eastern half of the country is solely Mr. Putin's doing. That simply isn't so. This all began with the rejection of the tripartite agreement that Mr. Putin proposed to Chancellor Merkel. One of the things that we forget is that Mr. Putin is surrounded by hawks himself. He's something of a moderate. he too is surrounded by high-level politics. He is not some modern-day czar like this ridiculous Frontline documentary that was just shown a few days ago. There are different competing interest groups within the Kremlin as well. And that's something that either policymakers in the United States are ignoring or they're ignorant of. But I can't believe that they're ignorant of. The deal, as far as I know, is that the IMF agreed to provide Ukraine with $17 billion in aid in 2 tranches over 2 years, with them, I think, getting $3 billion immediately. Well, that strikes me as being about half as much as they need.
To pay Russia.
Yeah. So this is...
Explain that part, to pay Russia.
Ukraine owes Russia a lot of back payments for gas that it's bought and didn't pay for. Then Ukraine tried to replace Russian coal with South African coal, and it didn't pay for that either. So nobody will sell to Ukraine because it's the most corrupt country in Europe. And Russia made a loan to Ukraine from the Russian Sovereign Fund, and there was a statement in this loan that if Ukraine's debt rises above, I think, something like 80% of its GDP, the entire $5 billion loan falls due immediately. So Ukraine may suddenly have to give its entire gold stock to Russia if the IMF doesn't give it enough. So the IMF did not give Ukraine enough to pay the debts that it owes Russia, and it's keeping it on a very short leash so that it could control it. Now, what kind of democracy can you have if your government is always in debt, always obliged to let your economic policy being dictated by the IMF and the World Bank, which means by the US Treasury, which means basically by NATO, by the American State Department politically. If you're kept on a short debt leash, democracy becomes meaningless.
But this is only until the debts are paid off. Then once the debts are paid off...
But they can never, they owe so much money, they can never pay it off because they can't export. The way you pay off a foreign debt is to earn foreign currency. Either they export, and Ukraine says, we're not going to export to Russia anymore. We're not going to export our resources to Russia so that it can invade us. We're not going to help its military industry. And nobody else wants their exports. So there's only one thing Ukraine has to export: half of its population. If you're between the ages of 20 or 30, you're going to be exported.
You do have many youth who are very interested in seeing their country invented again. It's been incredibly corrupt from day one.
Could you tell us what was wrong with Ukraine at this point? I mean, what are the youth upset about? What would they like to remake?
Well, living standards are incredibly low. So for instance, per capita incomes are half of what they are in Poland. And so if you want to start a business, you have to engage in all these payoffs. So you have a population that largely is a consequence of its Soviet inheritance in terms of a reasonably good educational infrastructure having been left behind. I mean, they're fairly well educated and they want something better. Many of them have been to West Europe and they want to know, why can't we have this? Why can't it be like this? And so the assumption is that if we implement these policies that the rest of the European Union has implemented, then we're going to look like Germany or Sweden. Well, the answer, of course, to that is that, well, it would be nice if it worked that way, but we really see only the last vestigial elements of this prosperous West Europe that was built after World War II on an entirely different set of economic policies. So people are confused. They see the prosperity that exists today in those countries, although again, it's being undermined and eroded, but they assumed that the policies that created that wealth are the ones that are being pitched to them now, when they are the exact opposite policies. I would counsel that people in Ukraine look at what happened with Mexico, with NAFTA in the mid-1990s when it was introduced. People thought that it was going to bring about this great prosperity for people, that wages would increase, that inequality would be reduced, that they would converge with Canada and the United States. Well, it didn't happen. It actually got worse for Mexican labor. This is what's being introduced. The EU association agreement is more like a NAFTA than it is the policies that were introduced in post-World War II Europe.
I spoke to some people in Ukraine over the last week, and I want to read what was said by a reporter over there. The issue was whether these loans being offered by the IMF and the World Bank are innocuous, or whether they're something else. He says, the country needs the IMF assistance package. The alternative is default. The idea is there's no alternative. We need the help from Europe, and they mean what they say.
You might be able to make a case for austerity and foreign investment and the linkage between the two. If what you had was a situation in which foreign companies were coming in and partnering with Ukrainian firms in order to help build up Ukraine's national economy. But that's not what we have, I think. What it looks more like is that you have these foreign enterprises that are looking to extract wealth from Ukraine rather than add wealth to it. So this means that people themselves are not going to benefit. All they're going to experience is a lot of pain.
Rather than saying there is no alternative, default is the alternative. Ukraine, Russia, and other post-Soviet economies can say, we were tricked. You promised to make us solvent. Unfortunately, you've made a very bad loans. We're sorry about that, but we're going to make a new start like we should have back then. And we're going to do exactly what the Allies did in Germany in 1948, a clean slate. Wipe out all of the domestic debts and let's start again. If it's a choice between paying the foreign bankers or supporting our own national survival, any country is going to go for survival, and you're asking us to commit financial suicide. The IMF crushed democracy in Ukraine, crushed any chance of Ukrainians to make their own policy. Finance is basically achieving what war used to achieve. Finance is the American mode of warfare, not in the military sphere, but purely financial. It's America's form of warfare against democracy.